This is one of those messages that it's going to relate to all of you, some a little bit more than others, but I hope that you'll kind of bear with me. This is Super Bowl Sunday, and so there are going to be some analogies. You ladies, one day I'll make some analogies out of knitting or quilting or something, but today it's Super Bowl Sunday, so I'm going to make a few analogies. I want you to picture this. You're a Cincinnati Bengal offensive lineman, and you're in your stance, and you look across, and you see this defensive lineman for the Rams that is a giant of a man. And he's in his stance, and you eyeball each other, and you begin to count. You begin to count his fingers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 fingers on both hands. 6 toes on both feet. I don't know about you, but I'm going to talk to Coach about this guy. And there was yet a battle in Gath, where was a man of great stature, that had on every hand 6 fingers, and on every foot 6 toes. That's 24. He was really better at math than most, if you go to counting fingers and toes. That's not in here. He was born to the giant. And when he defied Israel, Jonathan, the son of Shemaiah, the brother of David, slew him. These 4 were born to the giant in Gath and fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. Before we get into that a little bit, I want to remind you of a couple things. When we investigate the ark, we have to remember that it's both about the purpose of God, finding his path, his direction, his will. It's about recognizing his presence and realizing his power. And that's what the ark brought to the table. God's will, God's presence, God's power. So David had brought the ark back. And we find in 2 Samuel chapter 1, we have this history lesson, but it's much more than history. It's like a continuation of a story. In fact, you're going to find out that there are some peculiarities about this chapter, and I've already gone over those last week. But I found myself in a dilemma. I couldn't let it go. I had to keep going back, and I had to keep revisiting that before I could move on to verse 15. Something just didn't feel right. So I had to call a penalty on myself. Come on, you got to have fun with this. One more time. I had to call a penalty on myself. In the first verse, we find out that there's a famine. And that famine was brought on because it was a judgment that God had on the house of Saul. Now, the story is such, and I'll just read a few of those verses because I read them all last week. But this famine was 3 years ongoing. So David inquired of the Lord, and the Lord answered and said, "It is for Saul," and this is the part that I missed last week, "and his bloody house." I made mention of the fact that of the 7 sons and grandsons of Saul that were slain in order to abate the judgment of God, that they were innocent. I don't think so now. So I called a penalty on myself. We'll pick up the flags later after further review. But here's the deal. They were all subject, young men at least, to be privy to Saul's genocide that he attempted on the Gibeonites. So I don't know that any of them were innocent. There might have been one or two that had no knowledge of it. But based on what God was telling David now, I gotta renege on that. I don't think they were innocent. I think that the judgment was on the whole household, that it was referred to as a bloody house. And so, after further review, does that make it any less significant? Is it right? Now listen, is it right that 7 men would have to suffer for the sins of one? I don't know that they were suffering for the sins of one. I think they might have been atoning for their own sin as well. God had already judged Saul and his sons. They were hung up on a wall, and the men of Jabesh Gilead, they rescued those bones. They took them from off a wall, and they buried them under a tree. And we kind of got into the mother, Rizpah, as she would go to her 2 sons, and she would watch over them. She pitched a tent, and she wouldn't let the birds land on them in the daytime, or the beasts bother them at night. Now, that's a dedicated mother. We'll revisit her on Mother's Day. And so it brought me to this point. If it's not fair, if it doesn't seem right, Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 16 says that no father shall be put to death for his sons, for his children. And no child should be put to death for their father. Now, while God does make exceptions, I have to renege. I don't believe this was an exception. I think that God was allowing this judgment to atone for Saul's sin against the Gibeonites. Now, remember, they had entered into this covenant way back in Joshua chapter 9. They came in dressed up like a bunch of people that had been traveling for years, in old, tattered, and torn rags, shoes with holes in them, and they even had mildewing bread. And they act like they came from a great distance away. They were in line for Joshua to conquer next. So they said, yeah, I know we got mighty men of valor. Now, I'm going to use that term a few times today. I know we got people that are really, adept at battle, but look who represents Israel. God, the God. We can't do battle against him. So they faked it. They came in and they said, we want to strike a treaty with you. And so Joshua thought about it a while, and he said, I'm a lover, not a fighter, and it makes better sense to love and make a treaty than it would be to go to war with somebody that, is in some distant land. So they made a covenant. 3 days later, they found out that these were the next door neighbors. They were all mad. The princes of Israel, they were in an uproar. They got duped big time. And they were mad. They were ready to go and slay them. And Joshua said, wait a minute now. We gave our word. We gave our word. We entered into a covenant with these folks. So we're not going to break our word, even if they did obtain it falsely. Now, if lawyers would have been present, oh my. We'd have had civil lawsuits. We'd have had, a statute of limitations. We would have had anxiety and all of the things that, 400 years of oppression brought with it. The subjugation. If Black Lives Matters now, Gibeonite Matters would have mattered then. Okay? So if 7 innocent men, though they are not, are atoning for the sins of both themselves and their father Saul, and they died in order that these Gentiles, the Gibeonites, 400 years later, would both bless Israel and enter into this covenant with them, shouldn't we see a bigger picture? And here's the bigger picture. Now, I almost threw another penalty flag on myself. I don't have any more, so you're out of them, right? It's one thing for 7 men to die for something that was initiated by their father or their grandfather. But what about when one man dies for the sins of everybody? And that's the blood covenant of the New Testament. In order for Israel to be blessed, these Gentiles, that's what David says. He said, we not only need to have and make an atonement for what Saul's house has done, but that you will bless the inheritance of the Lord. David's saying, in order for us to really get right with God, we've got to make atonement for this, and you're going to bless us. This is where I almost threw another flag on myself. I think I gave you some lessons to be learned, okay? There were 3. When you make a promise, you ought to keep it. It's pretty good. Because when God makes a promise, He keeps it. God keeps His word. God keeps His covenant. And this is the part that I think I needed to camp out on a little bit. Aren't you glad that 2,000 plus years into this blood New Testament covenant, the covenant that Jesus, when He shed blood on a cross, you and I have appropriated that grace. We've said yes to the Lord. We accepted that gift of grace freely. Salvation's free, but it ain't cheap. It cost God His Son. Aren't you glad that 2,000 plus years later, God doesn't stop in the middle of the stream and go, I'm rethinking this whole thing. I mean, let's just give the people what they want. See, our God keeps His word always. You remember what we found out in the Psalms? That he that sweareth to his own hurt is considered worthy of double honor. So God is still keeping that covenant. And the thing that I did bring out last week, it was by the Gentiles. Saul broke a covenant 400 years later, and David had to fix what Saul blew and messed up. Which leads me to this conclusion. You and I ought to be grateful. The Gentiles had to be in a position to bless Israel. The Jews are not going to like what I'm about to say. These were Gentiles blessing Jews. That's what David said. In order for us to get back into the graces of God and receive His full blessing, we need for that sin to be atoned for, and we need for you to bless us. Here's my point. They could have broke covenant. The Gibeonites said, we don't want silver, we don't want gold, we don't want anything for Saul, we don't even want to go and kill anybody in Israel. We're not out to avenge, we're not trying to revenge. We want justice. David gave them a way out. He said, well, then what is it that you want? Anything that you need. They had an out. They could have said, well, how about after 400 years of subjugation, we're just going to say, we're going to walk out of here free men. They didn't want that. They had enough sense to know that they were right where they were supposed to be, and I believe that these Gibeonites began to know the God of Israel. Notice that it says, we're going to take those 7 and we're going to hang them on a hill unto the Lord. Saul had forgotten that. God didn't. So here are these Gentiles that David has to, I don't know if he has to swallow pride. I don't know if he has to come. I don't think that this king ever really bowed down to anybody but God. But he comes forward and he says, okay, we're going to atone for the sins of Saul, and then we want you to bless us so that we may receive a full blessing from God. And so here these Gentiles, they hang those 7 on a hill. But the word that you need to, the phrase that you need to hang out on and camp out a while is unto the Lord. They weren't after revenge. They didn't even want to get out of the covenant. You know, I think back to in fact, I got to share this with somebody this week. I think back to the day that I received Christ. A lot of things have happened. Good, bad, ugly. They've all happened. And they have made Romans 8:28 even the more true. All things work together to good to them that love God, to them that are called according to his purpose. God is still working on me. And sometimes this warrior is a child. He's a child. But he's one of the king's kids. And so are you. You're one of the king's kids. That makes something very special and unique about you. We celebrate your victories, like we heard about this morning. We pray over your defeats. And even when it gets ugly, you've got people around you that try to understand, and they laugh with you, and they weep with you, and they cry and pray for you. You want to break that covenant? I don't. I preach a message, and I don't think I've preached it here yet, and it's on the church. And I will start out by saying, and I'll just give you a little bit of a cliffhanger. You know, some of the worst things that have ever happened to me have happened to me at church. But some of the best things that have ever happened to me in church. I met my bride-to-be on a Wednesday night in church. God brought that back to my remembrance this week. She's wearing this corduroy jumper with this orange turtleneck sweater. You know what's weird? I asked her, what did I have on? She can't tell me. Right, Steve? Huh? Works both ways, girls. All she wants to do is remind me that I used to wear these black platform shoes. I was a lot taller in 1978. I put John Travolta to shame. When I begin to look at this and I begin to recognize that these lessons, they do, you got to be really careful when you look at a historical text. You're not trying to embellish. You're not trying to make it say something that it doesn't. And you got to be really careful that you don't spiritualize everything. But there are some principles, and there are some things to apply, and there is a driving force behind this. And this is why the 21st chapter of 2 Samuel is given to us in the first place. So when you break your word, you really kind of invited some kind of a famine into your life. Real or unrealized, it's still there. And some people wake up way too late to the fact that they're not really receiving God's blessing. They abide in his mercy. I'd rather abide in his blessing than just his mercy, though mercy is good. And is there a better example for motherhood than what we find in verse 10? I don't know where it is. We'll visit that again on Mother's Day. So we made two observations. Number one, God will always honor those that honor him and keep his word, because God keeps his word. Aren't you glad? He does not change. He who has no beginning and no end, the Alpha and the Omega, he keeps his word, he does not change. And number two, the second observation is that God has always related to men with covenants. It pains me to say that I can relate more to what I'm about to do than I care to. But I got to step aside for this one. 4 lessons from the text. that we read in verse 15. You want to know what happened to Goliath's relatives? Well, they show up. Goliath's got brothers. He's got sons. Well, they show up. Verse 15. Now, I want you to understand this. There's a continuation of thought here. The writer, inspired by God, nowhere else but here does he make this attempt at disclosing something about both the heart and the mind of God and also about David. Verse 15, moreover, the Philistines had yet war again with Israel, and David went down and his servants with him and fought against the Philistines, and David waxed faint. And Ishbi-Benob, man, what name, which was of the sons of the giant, the weight of whose spear weighed 300 shekels of brass weight, he being girded with a new sword, wanted to break that sword in by slaying a king. You can clap for the Lord. You can say hallelujah. You can say amen. You can say oh me. Because some of you are going to relate more to this than others. The first lesson right out of the gate is that David still has the heart of a warrior. But he just doesn't have the tools anymore. He's older. He's much older. And so he goes to make war with these giants once again. And he can't keep up. He grows weary. He grows faint. He's going to fall under the blade of that giant. I found something out this week. Just one more thing. And I think some of you, most of you, can relate to what I'm about to say. I still feel like I'm 21 in here. But I'm not out here. I'm not. I can't do the things I once did the way I did them. And I'm sometimes so stubborn. And I keep trying. I don't fault David for trying. Do you? I don't fault this king for going out to battle these giants. But he's about to fall under the edge of the sword. There's a couple of thoughts, just thoughts. Well, if God was with him in 1 Samuel 17, is God not with him now? Yeah, he is. You know how many men Saul's leadership produced to slay a giant? Not one. Not one. Do you know how many men David's leadership produced that would be willing to slay a giant? Many. Many. And so David went out to battle as he had done before. This is his last military campaign. He's still king, but it's the last time he's going to go out to war. Why? Well, the Bible tells us why. But Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, succored him and smote the Philistine and killed him. Then the men of David sware unto him, saying, Thou shalt go no more out with us to battle, that thou quench not the light of Israel. The first lesson, whether we want to admit it or not, inside this armor is a child. Still a child. he's still naive enough to believe that God's going to give him a victory. Though he, and I don't want to paint the wrong picture of this being an old man that's just decrepit and he can't do anything. No, the guy's fighting a giant. He just doesn't have the tools anymore. So instead of a smooth stone, God sends somebody to stand beside him. That's why. We need Jeff and Josiah. We got to have them. Because this warrior's getting tired. The Steves. I got to have them. The Logans and the Keiths. I got to have them. Royce. I got to have them. I got to have more. Now, I'm not foolish enough to put myself in the same camp with David. But the principle's still there. So, first lesson. This warrior's still a child. David still had the heart of a warrior, but he just didn't have the tools. And so God sent him some help. Along the way, I've looked back, and the Lord brought all this to my attention this week. I have seen different seasons in our lives, in our ministry, and it seems as though there's always been a pivotal time when I needed somebody. I needed a particular group of people at a particular time. Now, I don't read into this that David asked for help. I'll get to that in a minute. But I don't think he refused it either. Abishai is one of those mighty men of valor. He was over one of the company of David's divisions that were made up of men of valor. If I just did a character study on Abishai and Joab and some of these men, they're remarkable. What some of these guys did. On more than one occasion, Abishai was ready to take and slay Saul, say that real fast, slay Saul, and David said, no, you don't touch him. There's a quandary with these young men. You have to have them, and sometimes you wonder why. I'm sure there were times when David looked at Abishai and thought, Lord, you got to send me somebody else. The guy is trying my patience. But here's the deal. When David needed him, there he was. And so he slew that giant. Lesson number 2. You ought to be writing this stuff down. Not because I'm giving it to you, just because it's that great. It's that good. Number 2. Giants always have relations. They've got kin. You remember back when I preached the message out of Numbers chapter 13, and we were talking about it as the spies went over into the land, and there were giants in the land, and they saw themselves as grasshoppers in their sight. And the first part of that message was either killing giants or slaying grasshoppers. The 12 came back, and 10 of them brought back what the Bible calls an evil report. They said, yeah, it's a land that flows with milk and honey. Sure, there are these grapes. They're like basketball. I mean, it's everything God said, but there's also giants in the land. They weren't lying. But the part they got wrong was when they came back and they said, we are but as grasshoppers in their sight. That's on them. So the second lesson is that giants always have kin. When you slay one, there's 4 others that'll come forward. When you think you got one taken care of, the rest of the family shows up. And so that's something that you and I need to remember. We need to learn from that. Some of our giants may be time, disease, sickness, sin, things that interfere with God truly blessing us. But I don't doubt, see, I'm talking to our church now. You don't have to prove anything to me. You've already proven all you're ever going to need to prove to me. And I hope vice versa. You have the warrior spirit. You're inclined not to give up or give in. You have that. I wouldn't insult you by saying you need to get your act together. I would just simply remind you that if you think you slew one giant, there's probably another one around the corner. So, guess what? Verse 18. It came to pass after this that there was again a battle with the Philistines at Gob. And then Shabbakai, the Hishathite, slew Saph, which was one of the sons of the giant. There's another one. David's not slaying him. Some of his men are. As best I can realize, David's military career ended in verse 17. He didn't go out anymore. But there's still a battle to be won. There are still giants to slay. And so here was one of those mighty men that went out and slew this giant. And then verse 19, and there was again a battle in Gob with the Philistines, where Lehanan, the son of, here we go, Jairah o Ergim, man, that's a giant to me, the Bethlehemite, slew the brother of Goliath, the Gittite. Another giant. Now, guess what? These are, the best we can tell, the last of the sons of Anak. This is the last of them, so to speak. And by the way, the staff of whose spear was like a weaver's beam. I think we figured that out, what the spearhead of Goliath was one day, and it's 8 pounds. Every time he threw a spear, it's like throwing a shot put. Try throwing an 8-pound shot put and see what happens. I couldn't throw it as far as I could throw that flag, I guarantee you. And there was yet a battle in Gath, where was a man of great stature, this is what we read about a while ago, that had on every hand 6 fingers and on every foot 6 toes, 24 in number, and he also was born to the giant. And when he defied Israel, Jonathan, the son of Shemaiah, the brother of David, slew him. Took him out. Time out. Those are the kind of men I need around me. Those are the kind of men that I need around us. The question goes out, are you going to be that guy? Not to leave the ladies out, you don't have to put on actual armor to be valiant. Some of you have a heart of a lion. I won't embarrass you by telling you who you are, but some of you have the heart of a lion. I wouldn't want to get on your bad side, so don't let me. These 4 were born to the giant in Gath and fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. Number 3. and we're done. There's two more, but number 3. The hardest thing for me to do is to accept help from others. You know, I am learning, and I learned something a long time ago, that it takes more effort for me to teach people how and what to do than it does for me to just do it myself. But it's not more profitable. So, the hardest thing is to accept help from others. Subpoints. The arm of the flesh will fail us every time. It failed David. It fails. You get old enough that you just realize you can't do what you once did. Now, Jeff, Josiah, some of you guys may not be there yet. You live long enough, trust me, you'll get there. What are these giants? Well, I think I mentioned a few of them. Time, sickness, age. Yeah, I think it's great what Caleb did at the age of 80. Right arm. Yeah, at 80 he went out and took a mountain because it was promised him. I think it's great what Moses did at 80. I'm hoping to make 68. Exceptional men and women. Okay, so Brady's retired. I'm slow. I didn't know what a goat was. I thought it were the things that we raised at the farm. And I kept hearing all these terms about, well, he's a goat, she's a goat, they're a goat, they're a goat. I'm like, no, they're not. We got goats at home. Greatest of all time, duh. So Brady retires. There's something about retirement. There's a book I read, there's a movie out called American Underdog. It's about Kurt Warner. Great book. There's something about that underdog spirit that we root for. We want to see that at its best. Most of these men will tell you that their idea is to go out on top. They don't all get to do that. David's military career ends right there. I think it's important. I think that God's showing us some things. I think that we can apply some of those things. No, I don't plan on putting on the armor and going out and beating up on somebody. I'm just saying. The third lesson is that sometimes it's the hardest is to ask for help. And number 4, and I think this is what you're waiting to hear from me, as I want to hear this from you also. As long as I have breath, I will serve the Lord. As long as we have breath, we will serve the Lord. I know you got the Super Bowl on this afternoon, but you get an opportunity. Go read Psalm 132. It's kind of like David's reflection of his life. Many believe that it was written right about here. So he lays down the sword. He takes off that armor. But he is listen, this is what I need you to understand. He is no less God's servant. I'm not sure what to do now. If I give an invitation, I'm probably going to start bawling like a baby, but I think I'll give one anyway. Sometimes we just need people to go, I'm for you. I'm with you. Whatever, I'm with you. I want to be that man or woman. I want to be that person that's with you. And I know that, when the COVID thing hit, we all kind of distanced ourselves, and Josiah says he's sick, so stay away from him. But I don't know if that's true. That he's sick, yes, but that I'll stay away from him. Our invitation, I need you to bow your head. Miss Terry doesn't have to come forward. Miss Allison, just stay where you are. I want you to go to someone other than your spouse. Nothing wrong with that. You can do that at home. But I want you to go with someone, and I want you to just tell them what it is about them that you appreciate. And pray with them, and that'll be your invitation.